The reason they don't take any samples from Southeastern tribes is because they don't want any genetic markers that have the potential to be considered African to show up in a population that is labeled indigenous. The Southeast United States poses a problem for two very specific reasons. One, it retained a high level of American Indians, and two, because originally it was a refuge for a lot of the indigenous Europeans that were either fleeing from the wars and the population replacement, or were fleeing after the exile of melanated peoples starting in the 1500s from the Iberian Peninsula. You had a lot of melanated people in this region. And remember, there is a worldwide campaign to classify all melanated people as African. So if you took samples from the Southeastern tribes, you have the chance of coming up with genetic markers either via the mixed in European route or through the indigenous American Indian route that have been classified in modern population genetics as African. So then how are you going to explain how this group of people who have supposedly been on the continent for thousands of years are coming back as African? You can't. So they save everybody all the trouble and they focus on the tribes that they know are descended from a completely different group of Indios. Now, this is not to minimize that some of those tribes absolutely do have indigenous roots in the Americas, but our term indigenous is very liberal here. Many of the tribes that you showed in that picture and many of the tribes that are sampled for population reference groups are descendants of the Indios reducidos, the Indios amigos, or the friendly Indians that were helpful, I guess, under the Spanish Empire. And not just helpful for the empire, but they also took in Indios from all over the Spanish Empire. Now remember, the Spanish used the term Indios for all indigenous people, but their empire wasn't only in the Americas. It's also in the Philippines and parts of the South Pacific. But very specifically, there was a group that they called Indios Chinos, and those were people from China and Southeast Asia that weren't necessarily indigenous to the Philippines or the islands that they had colonies, and they also weren't free colonists. So they kind of gave them a different classification. Anyway, all of those people became Indios. And then coming over to the New World, that title Indios transferred from Spain to Mexico to the United States. But Nicole, why is all of that relevant? It's because if you know that those groups of people are going to have high levels of DNA that are likely going to trace back to East Asia or somewhere in Asia, then it supports the narrative of everybody coming over on the Bering Strait, and it takes away any chance of the markers that you have identified as African in showing up in your indigenous population. So no, you'll never get DNA reference groups from the Southeast United States, and probably really never concentrated along the east coast of the United States. Because then you would have to answer the question, how do you have so many people who have genetic markers that are different than what we've decided is the indigenous profile of the Americas?